Dr. Jennifer Clapp is an expert on the political economy of food security and sustainability in a global context. She has published widely on the impacts of financial actors in the global food and agriculture sector, the politics of trade and food security, and the social and ecological impacts of corporate concentration in the agri-food system. She is currently a Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability and professor in the School of Environment Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo, Canada. Her most recent books include Food, 3rd edition, Speculative Harvest, Financialization, Food and Agriculture, and Hunger in the Balance, the New Politics of International Food Aid. She is Vice Chair of the Steering Committee of High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security and Nutrition of the UN Committee of World Food Security, a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Her interdisciplinary research has been recognized with numerous awards. She holds a PhD in International Relations and an MSc in International Political Economy from the London School of Economics and a BA in Economics from the University of Michigan. I welcome and thank you for coming. Dr. Clapp, the floor is yours. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that very nice introduction, and I'm going to endeavor to share my screen. Thank you. It's a real honor to be invited to speak at the National Farmers Union Convention this year on the theme of corporate concentration in the global food system. And so my aim for this presentation is really to give a bit of a global overview at the start of this panel. And I'll do my best to do this in the 20 minutes allotted. And I just want to start out by saying that corporate power was a key issue that was raised by civil society groups at the start of last year's UN Food System Summit process. And civil society was very disappointed that the UN summit paid very little attention to the question of corporate power. And in fact, many civil society organizations walked away from that process because they saw that summit as being too welcoming of corporate actors, especially in an era when there was so much concentration in power in the food system. So what I'd like to do today is talk about why corporate power matters in the global food system, especially for broader food systems goals such as livelihoods, equity, environment, and healthy diets. So I've organized my comments around 3 key questions, and these are: first, what are the main driving forces behind growing concentration in the global food system today? Second, how does concentration enhance the power of agri-food firms, and why does that matter? And third, what are the lessons for current debates on food systems transformation? So first, the first question, what are the main driving forces behind growing concentration in the food system today? And I just want to start out by saying that growing corporate concentration in the food system has followed patterns of corporate consolidation in the broader economy in recent decades. And we've seen in recent decades a record in merger and acquisition deals that have really taken off. And you can see here that they were quite high around 2015, 2016, and then again, a big surge in 2021. In fact, in 2021, $5.8 trillion worth of merger and acquisition deals globally. And if I could update to 2022, we don't have the full data yet. It's gone down, obviously, somewhat because of the global recession and the war in Ukraine. But generally, in the last decade, we've seen some of the biggest corporate mergers that have happened across the whole economy have actually been in the agri-food sector. We've seen big deals such as the 2013 deal between Kraft and Heinz, which was a massive deal, and also the 2015 merger of Dow and DuPont, also a very big consolidation in the sector, and also Anheuser-Busch and InBev with SAB Miller in 2008. And each of those 3 mergers I just mentioned formed firms that were worth well over $100 billion. But we've seen other mergers as well. They're constantly going on. We've seen Keurig and Dr. Pepper link up, Syngenta and ChemChina, which is now about to be swallowed by Sinochem, a merger between Amazon and Whole Foods, Monsanto's purchase of Bayer, Agrium and Potash, corporation coming together to form Nutrien, which is the largest fertilizer company in the world, based here in Canada. So these are just some of the deals that we've seen in recent decades in this sector. And so the result of a lot of this consolidation, which has been really increasing over the past 30 or so years, is that we see now extreme concentration across the entire agri-food supply chain, with just a handful of companies dominating markets in almost every stage of those supply chains. So we now, for example, have 4 companies that control 70% of the global agrochemical market, 4 companies controlling around 60% of the global seed market, the top 4 grain trading companies controlling 70 to 90% of the market. We don't really know, it's hard to get data on this because some of the firms are private firms, but even in specific commodities, for example, 75% of the banana trade is controlled by just 5 firms. The cocoa trade, 60% of it is controlled by just 3 firms. So there's just a lot of concentration going on in agri-food trade. And then in big food, we have also a lot of concentration, maybe a little bit less because there are so many companies, but we do know that the top 10 firms in the processed food sector control around 40% of the sales of the top 100 firms, and they have huge revenues. And in some subsectors of the processed food segment, we have real concentration. We see this in soda and sweetened beverages, but we also see it in beer. So for example, right now, the merger between Anheuser-Busch InBev and SAB Miller resulted in a firm that now controls 1/3 of the global beer market. And we also see extreme concentration in the domestic context in this sector as well. And the meat sector is a really important example where we see, for example, in Canada, just 2 firms controlling around 95% of beef processing and top 4 firms in the US controlling around 85% of the US meat market. And again, retail as well. At the domestic level, it can be quite concentrated. So we know that in Canada, the top 5 retailers of food retailers control around 80% of the market. So concentration is rife. It's happening all across the system. And we have to pause and ask, well, why is this happening? So I want to talk about 3 main forces that are contributing to this consolidation. And the first force, or the first driver I want to talk about, is financial incentives. And financial incentives are usually a leading force with respect to mergers and acquisitions happening across the sector. It's often when firms are facing declining profitability that they're pressed by their shareholders to reduce their costs, to increase their market share, or to expand their product offerings. And usually they can accomplish these goals of lowering their costs, increasing their market share, or expanding their offerings by buying up rival firms. And financial incentives, they really matter in recent decades, especially as we're seeing greater financialization of the global economy. And what that means is that there's just a greater role for financial actors, financial institutions, and financial motives that are driving the global economy, where finance, rather than real, what we call the real economy or goods and services, finance tends to be an overriding incentive that's going on there. And that's been happening in the agri-food sector, especially as we've seen growing investment all across the sector in all of those segments I just showed in previous slides by what we call asset management companies. And these are the big companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, State Street, Capital Group. And each of these investment companies actually controls trillions of dollars of the global economy. So BlackRock, for example, manages around $10 trillion, which is a humongous sum. And what's interesting is that these companies that are investing in shares in other firms are totally invested into the agri-food sector. They actually own significant shares across many of the biggest agri-food companies. And so collectively, they can own up to 30% of a company. And if you think about it, like if they're the main shareholder, they're going to have a lot of influence over the agri-food corporations. And when this happens, it's referred to as common ownership in the literature. And research is showing that when common ownership is very large, it tends to encourage more corporate concentration because these financial companies are putting pressure on the other firms to actually merge, to lower their costs, to expand their market share or their product offerings. Another driver is technological change and what I would call product complementarities. That's done a lot of, it's caused a lot of consolidation in recent years across the food system. So for example, the recent mergers in the agricultural seed and chemical sector, where we saw Bayer and Monsanto come together and Dow and DuPont, these were part of the latest iteration in the consolidation in that sector based on technological change. And so what we saw was a tighter complementarity happening then through these mergers between seeds and chemicals, and also with investments in digital agriculture. But we're also seeing in other areas of the food system as well. So for example, in the processed food sector, we're seeing large meat companies like Tyson and Cargill. They're actually rebranding themselves as protein companies and investing in plant-based meat alternatives, as well as cell-based synthetic meat startup companies. And then we're also seeing mergers happening here with this sort of complementarity with Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, for example, trying to bring together two firms with very different sets of expertise, online retail and Whole Foods, and bringing it together into a new kind of online grocery shopping business. And a third driver that I want to talk about is the regulatory environment, which really matters. Here we've seen increasingly lax enforcement of competition policies in the neoliberal era. So we've seen, for example, as neoliberalism has really encouraged more market incentives and market-driven policies, antitrust, which used to look at issues of market concentration and market structure, has increasingly only focused on prices. And what that means is that the regulators who look at different mergers and decide whether to let them go ahead, basically their litmus test is whether that merger will lower prices or whether it will raise prices. But it doesn't pay a lot of attention to those market structures in terms of whether this creates a concentrated system that keeps other firms out of the business. So how does concentration enhance the power of agri-food firms, and why does this matter? So when specific markets are dominated by just a handful of firms, there are concerns that those firms have access to these different kinds of power. And I just briefly want to say what those kinds of power are. So first, they have the power to shape markets, which is often referred to as market power. And this allows firms to influence both producer and consumer prices. So concentrated firms, for example, when there's just a few of them in the market, they can decide what price they're willing to pay suppliers. And this has been a huge issue in the livestock sector, as well as small-scale fruit and vegetable farmers, particularly in developing countries, face this problem of that buyer power, where they really have very little say over those prices that they get for the products they produce. And at the same time, those firms are often accused of simultaneously driving up prices that consumers pay. And we've seen this with a lot of concern in Canada in recent months, for example, over grocery retail prices. And the Competition Bureau, for example, is studying grocery retail right now to see if there is this tendency to push up prices. Corporations that are concentrated also have the power to shape material aspects of food systems. In other words, how they look and how they operate. So when there's only a few firms in the sector, they have the power to influence food production technologies, for example, by selling only high-tech inputs because it's more profitable for them. But they also have the power to shape labor conditions, which is basically a real issue in many parts of the global food system, where we have modern slavery type working conditions in tea plantations, seafood processing, et cetera. And we know that there have been poor health and safety conditions and weak worker rights, for example, in the meatpacking industry, including in Canada. And they also shape the way that, supermarket shelves look. Like, while we may see many products on the shelves, we know that when that ownership is concentrated, it's a false choice because many of those products are basically owned by the same companies. And they also have the power to shape policy and governance. So when there's just a few firms dominating in a market, they're more able to coordinate their lobbying activities to gain access to public policymakers. An example of this was at the UN Food System Summit that I already mentioned, but corporate actors there, they played a significant role in shaping the action tracks of that summit. As you can see here, many big companies were directly involved. So what are the implications? First, I just want to, stress that when this kind of power is exercised, it really matters for justice and rights within food systems. Excessive power can undermine the agency and voice of less powerful actors within food systems. So we are talking about small-scale food producers, food system workers, women, racialized communities, youth, ordinary citizens end up with less voice when there is excessive power in the system. And it also matters for sustainability of food systems because when there is just a few corporations, in a sense, setting the terms of what food systems look like, they can really shape that innovation towards, for example, production methods like digital and other kinds of herbicide-dependent agriculture that can have important consequences for health and sustainability. So what are the lessons? And I will try to quickly go because I'm seeing my time is running out here. But what are the lessons for current debates? Well, as I said, the Food System Summit was called to address a lot of these important concerns we've been talking about inequities and environmental degradation, and the failure to ensure everyone has access to an adequate diet. And it called for fundamental transformation of food systems to make them sustainable and healthier, but it scarcely mentioned corporate concentration as an issue, as I've stressed. So to conclude, I'd like to talk about the agenda that we need going forward to address corporate power in the food system. And there are lots of measures one could take. I'm only going to focus on 3 given the time constraints. So the first one is that we need stronger and wider competition policies. And I know Keldon's going to talk about this, so I'll keep myself short here. But basically, we need antitrust policies because they focus currently quite narrowly on price impacts, as I've already mentioned. They need to go wider. They need to look at broader issues of market structure, as well as broader issues beyond just those economic ones. We need to think about how mergers and acquisitions and concentration affects innovation, how it affects environment, and how it affects health. And getting that broader antitrust policy is extremely important to rein in those ways in which corporations can exercise power in the food system. We also need more public sector support for alternative food and agriculture models. So if we want to transform food systems in ways that bring more diversity and sustainability into the system, it's important for the public sector to encourage innovations in infrastructure that are not solely driven by the profit agendas of big businesses. And so this means more public funding to alternative agriculture, as I mentioned. But we know that in many countries, most countries, including Canada, public sector spending on alternative agricultural initiatives such as agroecology or organic production, they're just a tiny fraction of overall spending, public spending in the sector. And finally, we also need measures to curb corporate influence in the policy process. So we need stricter measures, for example, to prevent conflicts of interest. And that's essential, not just in government policymaking, but also in academic settings as well. So, at the same time, governments can do a lot more to democratize policy and governance spaces in food systems to ensure wider participation amongst people in food decision-making. And just an example here on the slide is from the People's Counter-Mobilization to the UN Food System Summit, which really tried to raise awareness about the issue of corporate power and to create autonomous spaces for civil society action in the absence of governments doing so. So just to conclude, 3 big takeaways: there's significant concentration all across food systems encouraged by financial incentives, technological change, and weak antitrust policies. Concentrated firms have the power to shape markets, material conditions in food systems, and policy and governance in ways that can negatively impact important food system goals. And third, addressing corporate concentration should be on the agenda for food systems transformation moving forward. And I'm so glad that this is the theme of this panel and many of the panels across the NFU convention this week. So with that, I'll just say thank you. And if you're interested in further reading, feel free to send me a message and I'll send you some articles. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and say thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. You've done such a wonderful job of kind of setting the stage of the global context and what we're facing, as well as those things to take away with us to begin to work towards dismantling this concentration of power.